There we are. There we go. So hopefully you can all see my screen with the presentation. So as I've already said, I'm Rhiannon Morgan, and I've also got Anna Wilson with me tonight, and we're the Heritage Policy Officers at Daventry District Council. And we're here to talk about the proposed Long Buckby Conservation Area, and the District Council is currently undertaking a district-wide review of conservation areas, and this is part of the District Council's statutory duty that's set out in the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act, which is to review the existing conservation areas in the district that have already been designated, and also to assess whether there are any areas that haven't previously been designated that may merit a designation, which is why we're looking at Long Buckby as one of our primary historic settlements. The point of doing these conservation area appraisals is that some of these areas haven't actually been reviewed before, so that this is a really good opportunity to determine whether the village merits a conservation area designation. And the appraisal work that we've done has come to the conclusion that a designation is now being proposed in the village, and you may have had a chance to look at the draft conservation area appraisal management plan and the proposed boundary, which have been put forward, and they are available on our website to view if you'd like to take a look at those. So conservation areas are defined as areas of special architectural or historic interest, and they are designated by local planning authorities through the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act, as I mentioned earlier. And they were originally brought into being in the 1967 Civic Amenities Act. And since then, there have been over 10,000 designated nationwide, and they form some of the county's most significant historic settlements, and those that are of special architectural and historic interest, as it says there. Long Buckby certainly falls into that category. And in terms of planning regulations within conservation areas, there are different planning regulations which seek to preserve or enhance the character and appearance of conservation areas. And conservation areas themselves can vary greatly in their character and appearance. So they often in our district tend to cover villages and towns such as Daventry Market Town, but they can also cover commercial areas, industrial areas, and areas of landscape, which all have very varying characters. And they can vary in size from only a handful of buildings to many hectares of landscape in some cases. So the variability of this character means that quite often they're influenced by lots of different factors, and typically some of those factors are the consistent land uses within an area, so for example that commercial or agricultural or industrial side, or the consistent use of vernacular building materials, the continued use of open spaces for particular functions, such as marketplaces, or agricultural use in certain open spaces. And also some of the factors that influence the character of an area might be how the character is actually experienced. So whether there are historic footpaths that have been maintained, or whether there are historic views that overlook particularly significant buildings or areas, for example. And together these all contribute to that character and appearance and the special interest of a conservation area. So turning to Long Buckby specifically, the character of the proposed Long Buckby conservation area is influenced again by a number of factors, and some of the things that make it particularly special, give it that special interest, are its significant settlement layout, which contains some areas of significant archaeological interest, such as the castle, and also the retention of particularly important areas that have that consistent function, such as the marketplace, and also the retention of its historic street pattern, which can be dated back through historic mapping and analysis, so that we can see that the historic street layout was set out several centuries ago and has been maintained in a legible form. It's also contributed to by the architectural quality of the buildings and the variety of its built environment. And a lot of the buildings within the village date from between the as early as the 15th century right up until the 19th century. A lot of the building stock comes from the 18th and 19th centuries particularly. And the use of the vernacular building materials again is a really important factor in creating that character. So both the use of historic ironstone, vernacular ironstone, which has historically been used throughout the village. Oh, we've just had someone enter the meeting. If you just bear with me, I'll just let them in. There we go. Welcome to those of you who've just joined us. We're just running through the presentation, so we're just going through some details about the Long Buckby Conservation Area, so hopefully you can see that presentation there. So as I was saying, part of the character is that consistent use of vernacular building materials. So ironstone, which has historically been used from the 15th up until the 18th and into the 19th centuries. And then the use of red brick with its industrial character that characterises a lot of the 19th and early 20th century historic building stock of the village. And it's not just the dwellings, it's also non-domestic buildings and boundary treatments that have been built in these vernacular materials. And particularly talking about non-domestic buildings, Long Buckby has been very visibly influenced by both the boot and shoe industry, which can be seen in a number of retained outbuildings and factory buildings within the village, which makes it particularly locally special. But also earlier than that, the contribution of the wool trade, which helped the village to develop in the way that it has. So it's a very complex settlement with a very complex character and a lot of layers to its historic environment. So I mentioned earlier that there are certain planning regulations within conservation areas, and these planning regulations are there to help the careful management of change within our special settlements, and where factors have been identified as making a positive contribution to the character of an area, it is expedient to try and preserve and enhance those features. So the planning controls seek to do this by removing permitted development rights, and these are primarily the permitted development rights for demolition of buildings, certain development works including building or demolishing walls, gates and fences, the cladding of buildings, certain alterations to roofing, side extensions and some rear extensions, the construction of outbuildings, and the installation of radio antennae and satellite dishes in certain areas. There are also controls over works to trees within conservation areas. So there is a notification process whereby works to trees over a certain size should be notified to the council with 6 weeks notification, and then the council can provide comments on those and give consent where those works are deemed to not harm the amenity of the area. And those works that do require planning applications to be submitted, those planning applications are determined with reference to published guidance such as adopted conservation area appraisals, and any other material considerations. So that might be a local plan or a neighbourhood plan for the area, or other documents such as village design statements, for example. So this is an image of the proposed conservation area for Long Buckby. I apologise, the image isn't terribly clear, but you can see this image in our draft conservation area appraisal and on our website, and the image is probably clearer in those documents, so I do apologise. It's a little bit difficult to see, but the proposed conservation area is the area that's shaded in the solid light pink colour. And then we also have the red polygons, which are listed buildings. And then just to the bottom left of the proposed conservation area, we have the hatched area, which is the scheduled ancient monument of Long Buckby Ringwork Castle. So that's the proposed area that we are putting forward for this consultation. And I think I'm now going to pass over to Anna, who is going to take us through a few details about the conservation area appraisals and the consultation.
Thanks, Rhiann. Thank you. So as Rhiann noted earlier, conservation areas are designated due to their special interest, and as part of the review we produce a conservation area appraisal and management plan, and these express the special interest and identify what about an area is important, as well as highlighting areas which might benefit from enhancement in the future or any threats to the character of the conservation area. So conservation area appraisals vary depending on the authority or the group that's produced them, but in general they contain an explanation of the development of the area, so how it's developed over time, its history, and this might include any archaeological interest as well. And they also include information about the architectural interest, which is expressed through building types, the styles, different styles of buildings, the different materials that are used within the conservation area, and the age of the buildings as well. The appraisals we produce also include some information on spatial elements which contribute to how the conservation area is experienced, such as views within the conservation area, views out from it, and also views towards it from the surrounding area. We also look at the contribution that open spaces make to the conservation area. Those can be spaces within the area or also around its periphery. And also modes of movement through the conservation area, which might include public footpaths. And we also look at the public realm as well, so things such as street furniture, signage and lighting. So together, all this information provides useful information for applicants and decision makers in assessing whether any development or smaller works are appropriate and whether they will preserve and enhance the character of the conservation area. Could I have the next slide, please? Appraisals are adopted by Daventry District Council as supplementary planning documents, which means they're a material consideration in determining planning applications, which affect the special interest of the conservation area. But within the hierarchy of documents that are used to assist the determination of planning applications, conservation area appraisals and management plans sit below what is known as the development plan, so the settlements and countryside local plan, and they also sit below any neighbourhood development plan as well that might be in place for the area. They sit alongside village design statements, which also have the status of a supplementary planning document. Let's have the next slide. One of the other things that we do as part of the conservation area review is to identify potential candidates for the local list. Daventry District Council maintains something called a local list, and that's something which identifies buildings and sites that are considered to be locally important, but they don't necessarily meet the criteria for statutory listing or scheduling. Local lists play a really important role in building and reinforcing a sense of local character and distinctiveness in the historic environment as part of a wider range of designation. Although local list status doesn't introduce additional planning controls, it does enable the significance of any building or site on the list to be better taken into account in planning applications that affect the building, the site, or its setting. Generally, buildings or sites that are added to the local list are those that are unlikely to be statutorily designated, like listed buildings and scheduled monuments, but instead they're recognised as non-designated heritage assets of local importance, and they're given protection through policy rather than legislation. Local list candidates are identified as part of the field work and the research that we carry out during the conservation area review, and they're assessed against a set of criteria that have been adopted by the council. If they meet those criteria, they are consulted on and they're adopted as part of the conservation area appraisal process. So the buildings in Long Buckby that are being proposed to be added to the local list are set out in the appraisal and management plan document. Members of the public can also propose buildings for inclusion on the local list. If you have a look at the document and there's a particular building or site that we haven't included in the appraisal, if you want to send us the details and the reasons why you think it should be added to the local list, then we'll consider it as part of this consultation. Could I have the next slide, please? So as Rianne's already said, conservation area status introduces some extra planning controls, but some minor developments such as domestic alterations and extensions can normally be carried out without planning permission under the provisions of the 2015 General Permitted Development Order, the GPDO. This can lead to incremental changes taking place that gradually erode the certain aspects of the fabric of historic buildings, their historic character, and that of the overall conservation area. Article 4 of the GPDO gives local planning authorities the power to limit these permitted development rights where they consider it necessary to protect local amenity or the well-being of the area. So using the provisions of Article 4 of the GPDO brings certain types of development back under the control of the local planning authority so that potentially harmful proposals can be considered on a case-by-case basis through planning applications. So this is another aspect of the work that we do as part of the conservation area review, where we identify features that would benefit from being included in an Article 4 direction. If considered appropriate, they are proposed in the conservation area appraisal, and the information that's in the appraisal document includes the permitted development rights to be removed and the locations that would be affected. So we propose those in the appraisal. And if it's adopted by the council, this doesn't bring the Article 4 direction into force. They're put in place through a separate process, which would take place after the conservation area designation. And it has a further consultation process that we would go through. So the next slide, please. Okay, so the current consultation that's running at the moment is 8 weeks. It started in November and it's running until January the 18th. The documents are available to view online, so that's the Conservation Area Appraisal and Management Plan, the consultation notice, and there's also a map showing the proposed conservation area. So you can view those on the District Council website on the Conservation Areas page. We can also send hard copies of the appraisal document out to you during the consultation period if you'd rather look at a paper copy. If you just get in touch with us and then let us know your postal address, we can send that out to you. In terms of commenting on the proposals, we have to receive any comments in writing, so you can send those via email or via post, or there is also a survey available on the website that you can fill in as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So once the consultation has closed on January the 18th, we will compile a report which includes all the comments that have been received and then our response to those comments and any resulting changes to the proposed boundary or the appraisal and management plan. That report is then presented to the council and it decides whether to adopt the new boundary and the appraisal document as a supplementary planning document. And following that decision, we write to all the properties within the conservation area to notify them. If the conservation area boundary is adopted, then the additional planning controls that we mentioned earlier would come into force immediately, and they would apply to all the properties within the designated area. You might be aware that in April, Daventry District Council will actually become part of the new unitary authority, West Northamptonshire Council. And you might be wondering what that means for the proposed conservation area. Well, conservation areas are a national designation, so the boundaries and the appraisal and management plans will be carried forward into the new unitary authority, and they will continue to be to exist and be used to make those decisions on planning applications. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So there again, we've just got the details of the consultation. So we must receive any comments by 5 p.m. on the 18th of January. We can't accept any comments after that date or time, I'm afraid. Again, I just reiterate that we do have to receive comments in writing, and we've got the email address that you can send comments to, and the postal address, and then at the bottom there, that's the web page address where you can find the documents and the survey if you'd rather fill in the survey. Don't worry too much about scribbling the details down, because I think the slides from this presentation are going to be available on the website towards the end of this week, so you should be able to look at those again. So I'm going to hand back to Rianne now, who's going to answer some of the questions that have been sent in.
Thanks, Anna. So yeah, as Anna said, we have had some questions submitted prior to the session, so I'll just go through those. Okay. So the first question that we had submitted to us is, which I think we've probably covered off, but I'll do it I'll read it out anyway and answer it. Is, will this conservation area initiative benefit or lose out from the absorption of Daventry DC into the West Northants Unitary Authority? So as Anna mentioned, conservation areas are designated by local planning authorities using national legislation, and as such the conservation areas themselves do remain in force, will remain in force, sorry, under any new authority. They don't necessarily have to, they don't require Daventry District Council to be in existence to remain as a designation. That also applies to the conservation area appraisals and management plans. So if the conservation area appraisal and the boundary were designated and adopted prior to Daventry District Council being absorbed into West Northants Council, then they would just continue to be in existence, and the conservation area appraisal would be used to determine planning applications as a material consideration. So that hopefully answers that question. The second question that we had was, how can protection of the environment be held up as a guiding principle in conservation and at all levels of planning? So I think this is referring to the natural environment, and effectively ensuring sustainable development and the protection of the natural environment are two key tenets of national policy. And the principles of conservation, both of the historic and the natural environment, are quite closely aligned. Often in, and certainly in the case of Long Buckby, the environment, the natural environment contributes positively to the character and appearance of conservation areas. And features of this are therefore usually identified through conservation area appraisals. So, and that might be the contribution of groups or specimen trees, green spaces, and often the countryside settings of conservation areas. And decisions relating to development in conservation areas will be made with the primary national objectives of those, the sustainable development and protection of the environment, environmental objectives, and the local historic distinctiveness in mind. So in coming to a balanced planning decision, they will all be a material consideration due to that national, those national tenets of policy. So again, I hope that answers that. Just as an extra, as a side, we do at Daventry District Council have other key guidance on matters such as biodiversity and the environment and landscape particularly. So they can be viewed on our website, or if you have any questions about that, those factors, if you email our planning policy department, and that's planningpolicy@daventrydc.gov.uk, then if you have any questions, someone from the planning policy department will be able to get back to you on those.
I'm going to be very rude, I'm afraid, because you're answering my questions, but the Long Buckby Ukulele Group, to which my wife belongs, is now in
We've
session.
only got this computer.
She's now in session, so I'm
Yes.
going to see if I can log on to you with my Kindle separately.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, no problem.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Okay. So we did have some other questions submitted as well, so I'll go through those now. So these following questions relate to the notification process for works to trees in conservation areas. So I'll just go through these. So the first question is, why do you think your definition of a tree will not either put an unsustainable workload on council staff or lead to widespread breach as residents do not notify you? So with the definition of works to trees which require notification within conservation areas, being those whose trunk diameters measure 75 millimetres at 1.5 metres above the ground level. So we have a number of conservation areas in the district, some of which contain very vast numbers of trees, and as I mentioned in the questions just previously, trees can make a very, very positive contribution to the character of a conservation area. And currently the levels of notifications which are submitted to the council don't place an unsustainable workload on staff, and it isn't expected that the designation of new areas like Long Buckby will produce an unmanageable amount of potential new notifications. The proposals that we produce, both for the reviews of existing conservation areas and potential new designations. Sorry, just letting that gentleman back in. There we go. The proposals are always produced collectively with our development control colleagues, who are the officers that primarily deal with the notification process that affects trees in conservation areas. And certainly no concern has been raised on their part relating to this. The aspect about whether we think that it would lead to a widespread breach of residents not notifying us of the works that they intend to carry out. The works in the first instance, the onus is on the person undertaking the works to notify the council, and we would generally expect in good faith that residents would do that. And the process of notifying the council is a straightforward one. It's a written notification, so that can take the form of an email or a letter, or we do have forms you can fill out as well, but it can just be a letter or an email if you prefer. That sets out the proposed works that are going to be undertaken, and the time scales for those works. And if you submit those 6 weeks prior to when the works are proposed to be undertaken, then that allows the case officers to assess the proposed works. So generally, as I said, we wouldn't necessarily expect residents to breach these planning regulations, and it isn't an issue that we experience in our other conservation areas. Obviously, if there were, because we do undertake monitoring of these our conservation areas, and if it were apparent that there were widespread breaches, then there would obviously have to be a review and some action taken. But it isn't an issue that we have experienced to date, and it isn't necessarily an issue that we expect to experience. So the second question is, if this is adopted, if the conservation area is adopted, must I submit a request for my buddleia, which requires pruning each year and is over 1.5 metres high before pruning and has a trunk diameter of over 75 millimetres? So this is a fairly common question in terms of if you are doing annual work to a tree, does it require notification each year? So what I would first say is a buddleia wouldn't fall under the categories of a tree within a conservation area, because it isn't a tree species. I think it would only be a tree species that fall under that category. and shrubs and other garden plants wouldn't be controlled under this notification process. But if you had a tree that required annual pruning, for example, then this would require a notification each year. But as I said, the process is quite straightforward, and our landscape officer at the council, Michael Venton, is commonly involved with people across the district who undertake widespread annual tree maintenance, and often comes to agreements with those people undertaking those works for rolling management. So our advice would be to get in touch with Michael Venton, our landscape officer, and have a chat with him about it, because the process is quite straightforward. But I wouldn't expect that a buddleia would be controlled under that regime in any case. So the third question is, why will you not have a more appropriate definition of a tree that is significant in height, e.g. over 10 metres and over 0.5 metres trunk width? So the regulations which cover trees in conservation areas and the notification process are set out in section 211 of the Town and Country Planning Act. And this is national legislation and can't be altered by the council. So those particular measurements, the diameter of 75 millimetres, the height of 1.5 metres, is nationally set, and the council cannot veer from those at all. They're not flexible, hence why we use them, and they are common to all conservation areas nationally. So the fourth question is, if the conservation area is adopted, must I submit a request for each of my 60 trees that I maintain every year, most of which are under 5 metres high? So if any trees fall within a conservation area, then notification of works to those trees will be required. But as I've already said, if the works are annual, so this includes things like annual thinning or pruning to promote growth, then you generally will be able to notify the council of those works collectively. So it doesn't necessarily have, you wouldn't have to put, if there were 60 trees, you wouldn't have to put 60 notifications in. The requirement is that you set out exactly what works are proposed, and what the circumstances are, so how many trees, for example, what species they are, and then our case officers can come and assess those and make a decision based on site visits and the information that's provided. Again, if it is something that's happening annually and it's happening year on year to the same area and the same group of trees, then our advice would be to get in touch with our landscape officer about the possibility of agreeing a kind of rolling management of those trees, and then you would only have to provide a notification collectively rather than, as I said, for 60 trees, 60 notifications. We wouldn't have to do that. So the next question is, I pollard self-seeded ash trees to harvest them for firewood. The main trunk is over 75 millimetres for the first 0.5 metres of the trunk, I'm imagining, and the wood that I harvest grows stems to about 8 metres. I chop down the stems as needed during autumn and winter. Do I need to notify each time? So the regulations stipulate that the trees that fall under the notification process have to be 75 millimetres in diameter, the trunk diameter, at 1.5 metres above ground and higher. So if the measurement of these particular trees, the trunk measurement, is only 75 millimetres for the first half a metre, and then it reduces in diameter, then it wouldn't be covered by the controls, and pruning of those trees can take place without having to notify the council, regardless of how long the branches are. It's the trunk diameter measurements that are the stipulation for whether it's covered by the controls. So the next question is why is there not a clear definition for the erection of outbuildings? What is a, in inverted commas, certain size? So the regulations within conservation areas stipulate that in order for the construction of an outbuilding to be deemed permitted development, i.e. you can construct an outbuilding without the need for a planning application to be submitted and planning permission to be granted, outbuildings in a conservation area cannot be constructed to the side of a house and cannot exceed 50% of the total area of land around the original house. So this is a technical explanation which can sometimes be a little bit confusing, and hence we kind of make it a bit less wordy on our website by saying a certain size, and it entirely is case by case led, because in calculating that 50%, that also has to take in any existing extensions and sheds and outbuildings that are already built on the within the curtilage of the property. So because it has to then be entirely a case-by-case basis, we cannot provide specific measurements for those outbuildings. And our advice would always be, in those circumstances, if you're considering building an outbuilding, you are in a conservation area, then the outbuilding may be permitted development as long as it's not to the side of the property, and as long as that 50% measurement isn't exceeded, sorry. And because of those very specific circumstances, we always advise people who are proposing the construction of outbuildings to get in touch with our development control department, because they will be able to provide case-by-case advice, which we cannot do in the conservation area appraisals because of those specific circumstances. So the next question is, the definition of walls doesn't say whether they are separate from a building and only part of the property boundary, which might be assumed. Do you intend to include internal walls, which would normally be over 2 meters? If not, can you explicitly state the scope? So yes, indeed, it doesn't include internal walls. Conservation area controls do not apply to the interiors of any buildings. They only apply to the exterior appearance of buildings. And in terms of the controls over boundary treatments within conservation areas, walls, gates and fences, that is only external property boundary walls. They can be freestanding or attached to the house, but it does not include interior walls. And those walls that are included in that, those controls are walls that would be adjacent to a public highway, waterway, footway, that are 1.5 meters tall or above, and walls that are 2 meters and above elsewhere within a conservation area. So it wouldn't apply to the internal walls of a house, which obviously usually would be over 2 meters, so you don't have to worry about those, doesn't affect those. The next question is, how much are the penalties, which I assume is a reference to whether there are fines for the breach of planning controls within a conservation area. Planning enforcement, which is what the term is for the action taken if there has been a breach of planning control, can only be considered when a building work or a change of use involved is unacceptable and requires planning permission. So usually an initial investigation by an enforcement officer from the council will seek to determine whether the works are unacceptable and require planning permission. And the council has a local enforcement plan, which can be viewed on the council's website and provides information on the principles and policies under which enforcement action may be taken. Normally an enforcement notice and possibly a stop notice as well if the works are continuing at the time, would be the first action taken by a local planning authority if it deems that the works are unacceptable and require planning permission, where a breach of planning regulation has been undertaken. Alternatively, depending on the severity of a planning breach, it might be advised that retrospective planning permission should be sought to regulate the works rather than serving an enforcement notice or a stop notice. But should an enforcement notice or stop notice be served, then the defendant has the opportunity to comply with an enforcement notice and regulate the works. And where the defendant doesn't comply with an enforcement notice and doesn't appeal against the notice, because there is a right of appeal against enforcement notices, then it is an offence, and a fine can be levied by a court. So if the enforcement is taken to a magistrate's court, then the fine can be up to a maximum of £20,000. If it's a very severe planning breach, then the case could be allocated to a Crown Court, and that's for severe contraventions, and in those circumstances the fine is unlimited. But this is obviously a really last case scenario. In as far as possible, in cases of enforcement, the local authority will seek to try and engage with those people who have undertaken the works to resolve it without the need for it to be taken to court, and that really would be a last case scenario. So the next question is, why is there no obvious detail on the website of the consequences of non-compliance? So the council does have a web page dedicated to local enforcement, and there is a link on there to our local enforcement plan, as I've said, but it isn't linked onto our conservation areas webpage. So this is obviously something that relates to the conservation areas, although the planning enforcement is much wider than just in conservation areas. So we will consider adding a link to our conservation areas webpage to the local enforcement webpage. And the final question is, what evidence is there that the change that has happened within Long Buckby in the past, that there is a need for this, and I assume that's the conservation area proposals. So the designation of a conservation area is not made purely as the result of an identified threat to character, although it can influence the decision to propose further measures such as Article 4 directions. But mainly, and certainly in the case of Long Buckby, the proposal of designation is due to the well-preserved and significant nature of historic environments. And in Long Buckby's case, this includes a high number of listed buildings, as well as many significant non-listed properties, the retention of its historic street pattern and village layout, which has developed over 900 years into a legible and visible manner, and the identified impact of local industry, both the woolen industry and the boot and shoe industry, on the character of the village. And these factors set Long Buckby apart in terms of its special historic interest from many other settlements in the district. And therefore it's been proposed to have a conservation area designated. And conservation area designation, alongside the information contained within the conservation area appraisal, seeks to preserve and enhance that identified character, through the careful management of change. So whilst there might be threats that are observed and identified to character, and then these are managed through the development and planning process, there doesn't need to be an identified threat for a conservation area to be considered. It's that special architectural and historic interest that is the main factor in designating a conservation area. So that is the end of the submitted questions that we had prior to the meeting. So we do just have a few minutes, so I will just open up the questions now. If anybody has any questions here, if you'd prefer not to ask a question here, then you are welcome to email us at the heritage@Daventry DC email after the meeting, if you'd prefer to, but I will just open it up. You should hopefully be able to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question.
Hello, it's me again.
Hello.
I managed to rejoin you.
Yes,
Can you hear
successful.
all? Yes. Long Buckby hasn't got a neighbourhood plan, has never devised a neighbourhood plan. We did have a village design statement. I don't know whether you've become aware of that, and whether
Yes.
it's still, would the village design statement still make a difference to any, any thoughts you had about the conserving the development area, or in any protection of that conservation area?
Yes, so certainly we were aware of the village design statement, and it was used in the production of the conservation area appraisal. There was a lot of useful information assimilated in it, and it was taken into account in the production of the appraisal and the setting out of the proposed boundary as well. And as it's an adopted village design statement, we as in terms of determining planning decisions, the council would use both the village design statement and an adopted conservation area appraisal to come to balanced planning decisions. If the design statement or the conservation area appraisal were updated in the future, then again they would it would be necessary that they wouldn't conflict with each other. They shouldn't ever contain information that conflicts, and they would both be used to come to any balanced planning decisions. And that's equally the same for if a neighbourhood plan were ever to be produced for the area as well.
Thank you.
It's okay. Are there any other questions at all?
Yes, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. It was really interesting to listen to. So I guess, you know, looking at your PDF on your consultation paper, I see actually quite a lot of buildings that are listed, so they're not really going to have any benefit from this. And I also see quite you know, a number of areas where you've chosen buildings that, or included buildings that are actually relatively modern. So an example of this is on Brinkton Road, where you included 6A, B and C. Now they were actually built as cottages within the last 15 years. So it seems very strange that you're including those. That's sympathetically done, but it seems strange that you don't have some more useful designation of buildings that should be included, you know, of being 18th, 19th century and older. You know, why can't we have some designation like that of buildings that are actually significant?
Yes, so that's it's a good question, and when we are proposing conservation areas, because in terms of that sort of middle ground, as it were, almost between not having any designation at all and relying on the normal planning system with normal permitted development rights, and then the jump to listed buildings, for example, which is a high level of designation that is reserved for very significant historic buildings. Conservation areas are a local designation that were created to be able to recognise local significance. So again, a lot of buildings, as you say, from the 18th or 19th centuries, particularly Victorian buildings that quite often aren't listed. Conservation areas that can again vary completely across the country depending on the local character of a local area. So because of the nature of a conservation area, because it is an area, whilst you can designate individual sort of parts of a village, for example, there's no limit on size. The nature of a conservation area is that it is the character of an area, the character and appearance of an area, which often is very, very difficult to reduce to discrete groups of buildings, for example. So quite often conservation areas are experienced with views from different areas, and in some cases it might be that there are modern buildings very close to historic buildings that may or may not be particularly sympathetic in terms of their design or materials, for example, but they're still taken in the experience of the wider historic environment. In our conservation areas, generally, the historic environment constitutes the majority of the building stock in that area, and that's certainly true for the Long Buckby conservation area. Where there are small pockets of modern development, the reasons usually that those are included is because removing those areas would create little islands where there isn't a designation. Generally, in terms of the management of conservation areas, that makes the process quite difficult, and it also means that in the future, if there were proposals for alterations to those buildings, then there wouldn't be the opportunity to enhance the character of a conservation area, for example, by replacing unsympathetic development with a more sympathetic development that might use vernacular materials, for example. And in the case of those examples where there has been sympathetic modern development, then usually we include those areas because they are a really good example of development in historic areas, and they can be used as an example for potential future development of what good development can look like. So that's the reasons that we include modern buildings, because otherwise you kind of end up with a little bit of a Swiss cheese effect, which does make it quite difficult to manage, and it also makes it quite difficult for those people who live in an area. If you have lots of holes, it can become quite tricky to set boundaries for those, for example, and there might be other features within those properties, curtilages like trees, or boundary walls, historic boundary walls, for example, that do positively contribute and would otherwise not be included within a conservation area. So I hope that provides a response to that. Do we have any other questions at all?
I found it quite interesting, your use of some of the subjective terms in terms of, you sort of said modern developments which don't reflect the historic character of the area. Buckby's a really mixed village, so it's got really mixed buildings from, there's a continuum. There's not been a point where you said, oh, we've had 50 years without buildings. Some of them are pretty hideous and poor quality, and that stretches not just within the narrow area, but within the wider areas of Buckby. You have a nice closely cropped shot of the school that doesn't include the hall on the infant school. You don't make any comment about the library. You have a picture of the historic Market Square pre-library, and then the library building gets added. So there's an interesting mix of photos there, which perhaps confuse somewhat, you know, what might be attractive with what is less attractive. You have a shot of, you know, the chip shop sign, and say that that's, you know, not attractive. And I find it, you know, I suppose concerning really that we're wanting to extend conservations into Buckby, whereas probably I think most people in the village would support a socking great conservation area on the fields between Daventry and Buckby, and that would probably be the most popular. You know, that in terms of preserving Buckby's character, having it as a separate and independent village and not swallowed up as an outskirts of another town would be a much stronger preservation of its character. There are lots of examples of villages on the edge of Northampton that are no longer really villages; they're just dormitory dwelling spaces, because all of the infill that has happened means that they've lost their identity. And so we're tackling a problem that I struggle to see evidence that, you know, Buckby hasn't managed in the past and survived in its varied character, and yet we're ignoring something that would utterly and completely fundamentally remove the character of Buckby. You know, that there is talk about the development of Buckby, of Daventry all the way to the M1, and that then becomes really remarkably close to getting across to Buckby. So it's that, you know, we're looking at a very small issue that doesn't seem to be a significant problem, and yet we're ignoring something that would much more fundamentally alter the character of Long Buckby as a village. It's interesting seeing your proposals, and I'm glad that you've been so clear in the way that you presented them. But you know, my past experience of seeing conservation areas is that they generate a lot of work for well-meaning household owners and little benefit, and that quite often, you know, development still carries on apace. And that, I would say, is, you know, why I struggle to see where the value of this is, other than in employing more planning officers. But yeah, thank you for your time and your presentation.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for attending. I would just mention that obviously the work that we do is a statutory duty that we're undertaking at the moment, and whilst our work may seem discrete in terms of its purpose, it does form an important part of the kind of wider planning system, and I completely understand that for a lot of residents of villages, particularly, development in you know, around towns or more urban areas can sometimes appear to be encroaching on open space, and that can you know, obviously raise concerns. In terms of the action that's being taken surrounding that, I wouldn't say it's necessarily being ignored. The District Council does have some quite firm policies surrounding development in what's termed the open countryside, and if you were looking for more information around that, the policies are set out in the Settlements and Countryside Local Plan, but if you had specific questions, then our team, the policy team, would be happy to discuss those if you had any particular concerns about any areas. And in terms of conservation area designation over landscape areas, conservation area designation does have to fulfill those two key criteria of architectural or historic interest. So whilst we can extend conservation area designation over areas of landscape, they do have to make a contribution in the usually either the historic interest, so whether they have an archaeological interest, for example, or contain evidence of an area's development that can be linked back directly to the body of a conservation area. Or they contribute to what's termed the setting of a conservation area. So again, that usually means that they have some sort of historic interest, but that also they are they contribute to how the conservation area is experienced. So whether that be through views, for example, or the consistent use of open spaces that relate to, again, the kind of main body of a conservation area and its character. So conservation areas themselves aren't necessarily the best way of preserving or resisting development on open spaces, and conservation areas themselves aren't necessarily meant to resist development. They're meant to help to steer development so that it is sensitive to the historic environment, and it's that kind of gradual piecemeal change that can often erode the historic character of an area as much as larger developments, for example. But if you did have any questions after this session about those aspects of the conservation area work that we do, or how conservation areas fit into the kind of wider remit of planning policy or the planning system, then please do get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to discuss any of that with you, with anybody, or any other questions that you might have. I'm fairly conscious of time, just as we did say we would have finished at 7:30. I don't want to keep people too long this evening, but does anybody have any final questions before we finish for the evening? No, I'll take that as a no. So I'd just like to thank you for joining us this evening, and I'd like to thank Anna as well for helping with the presentation. And if you do have any comments on the draft appraisal or the boundary, then if we could have those in writing by 5 p.m. on January the 18th, that would be much appreciated. And the information relating to the consultation can be found on our website. So I think that's probably where we'll finish for the evening. So I'd like to thank you all again, and say good night.
We're sorry you had such a small audience.
Oh, that's okay. I think we had a few people who were meant to come, but unfortunately didn't turn up. So, but it's appreciated that you all came along. Thank you very much.
I very nearly didn't get the link. It came through quite late, so only didn't realise I got it.
Oh,
I think
right.
it only came through yesterday.
Yes, we were having some issues with our email system, so I do apologise on that. But thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. It's much appreciated.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.